So let's look at a few more things. But basically, at this point, it's probably obvious that you have to decide for yourself whether your value system, your ethical sense and moral values drive you to take a stand on acting against climate change, speaking up for action on climate change by the governments, politicians, international bodies, and of course there are issues of what you yourself can do, but that's quite a separate issue in terms of what individuals can do in a system that's so heavily geared towards what is called a carbon trap. Pretty much anything you do, buy, eat, travel, everything affects greenhouse gas emissions. So what is the difference between demanding systemic changes versus relying on individual actions for reducing our impact on the planet? Okay, so the second step that came out of that survey was second answer was that we must act for the sake of the children. As I said, this is more complicated than one imagines. People have a very clear sense of saving wealth for their children, saving or providing enough resources for the children, and we have, I think, talked about how this can actually increase consumption because educated women have fewer children. Fertility rates are dropping everywhere, including India and China. And it seems rather counterintuitive that women who are educated and rich would want to have fewer children rather than more children. It turns out that they want to have fewer children so that they can give enough wealth to each child so the child can do well, which means what? Child can live a high standard of living, high consumption, high greenhouse gas emissions. So reduced population is not coming with reduced consumption. So this is a bit of a conundrum in terms of the ideas that population is bad for climate. Population is bad for all the pressures it puts on habitats, on resources, and so on. And yet, when you look at carbon footprint, the reduced population doesn't guarantee a reduced emissions if consumption per person keeps going up. We talked about this a little bit before. So thirdly, we must act for the sake of the earth and all its lives, because the community of earth and its lives has intrinsic and infinite value. So this word intrinsic value is used also for human beings in terms of intrinsic values and extrinsic values. So intrinsic values are where you value relations, you value environment, you value cleanliness, you value things that are shared, common goods, etc. Extrinsic values are more about image, power, dominance, wealth, whatever. So there are people who have intrinsic values that always stand up and fight for the environment and so on. And yet, when you flash these sorts of images that I mentioned before, where you're looking at broken sea ice with polar bears stuck on them, this was originally used extensively as a way to convey the message about climate change. Turned out that maybe that was not so effective because it was too far away and maybe it got repeated too many times. Plus, people begin to normalize things in their head. So, for example, the Syrian war has now gone on for a decade. In the beginning, there was a lot of outrage, a lot of concern, a lot of charity work, and so on. A lot of NGOs still work there, a lot of UN peacekeepers and so on, Doctors Without Borders, Engineers Without Borders, and so on and so forth. And yet, most people have moved on with their life, and the Syrian war doesn't make news as much anymore. And a pandemic, COVID, obviously came and took over everything, and pretty much nobody is noticing what the Syrian ruler is doing. So there is the question of how things just slide into the background if they drag on for too long as well. So yes, these are ethically good expectations of humans that we must act for the sake of Earth and all its lives, but it's not clear how it translates to action. So philosopher Kathleen Dean Moore writes, premise one, it's not just the sun in winter, the salmon sky that lights the snow, or blue rivers through glacial ice. It's the small things too. The kinglet's gold crown. This is a little bird in the U.S. I think maybe in North America. The lacy skeletons of decaying leaves, beautiful during the fall. The way all these relate to one another in patterns that are beautiful and wondrous. The timeless unfurling of the universe has brought the earth to a glorious richness that awakens in the human heart a sense of joy and wonder. Premise 2, it's right to protect what is wondrous and wrong to destroy it. This is a part of what right means, to enhance rather than to diminish what is of value. So again, this word value always has different meanings to different people. Plus, there are other pressures. For example, the human-tiger conflicts, human-wildlife conflicts, when wildlife preserves and invasion of wildlife that affects cattle, that affects agriculture, and so on. People act in unexpected ways. They may kill tigers, they may kill elephants, they may do all kinds of things that are not very obvious to people who are living far away from the conflict zones. So this is another thing that matters. The conclusion here by philosopher Kathleen Dean Moore is that this is how we ought to act in the world, with respect, with deep caring and fierce protectiveness, and with a full sense of our obligation to the future, that this planetary richness shall remain. Yes, makes perfect sense, but does it make sense to everybody? And even when it makes sense to some, the question is, what are they going to do to protect this ethical value? Are they going to stand up and fight? Are they going to pay more for protecting the environment, and so on and so forth? So it's always more complicated. Fourthly, yes, because the gifts of the earth are freely given, and we are called to gratitude and reciprocity. Okay? Can you argue with that? Not really. But again, the question is, who feels compelled to act on it? We must act from compassion, which requires us to reduce or prevent suffering. So compassion means feel together. And do we feel the pain and suffering of people far away who are being affected by the pollution we are creating here? So let's say you're sitting in a rich country, or you are in a poor country but you have a good rich life and you are living a good high carbon footprint life. What is your sense of compassion for those who are maybe in the same city, maybe just around the corner, maybe in another country, neighboring country, or you are sitting in the US and all the poverty is beamed on TV from Africa or South America? Then how far does your sense of compassion extend in terms of your actions to reduce and prevent suffering, especially if that means you have to consume less, you have to drive less, you have to eat less meat, and you have to fly less, and so on and so forth. So things get complicated very quickly, and also what gets sacrificed when push comes to shove is also always quite complicated. Sixth, we must act because justice demands it. Well, this is again, what is environmental justice? Who defines it? How do you enforce it? There are lots of grassroots organizations, indigenous communities, women, elderly, youth that are fighting for climate justice, environmental justice, and this is a good thing. It is beginning to put pressure on international negotiations on climate to include justice, gender balance, sustainable development goals, for example, how they map poverty, education, human development index, etc. to climate action, sustainable food production, sustainable water, reducing forest degradation and deforestation, and so on and so forth. Seventh, we must act because personal integrity society requires us to do what's right. So this is talking about support science, or we may all go under. So there is increased sense of awareness coming from local experience or remote news of remote experiences. And again, maybe people with intrinsic values are standing up, but there is another angle of this. The constant bad news about climate is also beginning to create a serious issue of what is called climate anxiety. A lot of youth are feeling very anxious about their future, which can be bad in the sense it may cause a reaction of fight or flight or freeze. So if they begin to feel hopeless that there is nothing they can do, then that could be bad as well. So there is also vision for the future that is needed, that plays on these intrinsic values and sense of ethics to do something about suffering, climate change, justice, and so on. So I'll come back and do make a few more points. This is a short chapter. I'm mostly talking from the material in the book, but also my own sense of how I value climate action, the choices, individual versus systemic changes, whether human beings are capable of behavioral change, and so on and so forth. Okay.